I'm Grace Williams, 68, and for 15 years I've carried the weight of being Hurricane Katrina's forgotten widow. My husband Marcus died saving others when the levees broke, leaving me with nothing but memories and mounting detour, so his family believed. At last month's reunion, I watched them whisper, "Broke widow," behind their champagne glasses. The same people who'd turned their backs when I needed them most. But that Tuesday morning phone call from Agent Rodriguez changed everything. What they didn't know about Marcus, about us, about the empire we'd quietly built, was about to surface. And the family that had dismissed me as their burden was about to discover exactly who they'd been underestimating all these years. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever been underestimated or dismissed by those who should have loved you most, this story is for you. Like this video to hear how the truth has a way of finding the light. The Williams family photo from 2005 sits on my dresser, edges worn from handling. Marcus and I, arms wrapped around each other at his sister's engagement party, both of us glowing with that newlywed happiness. We had no idea it would be our last family celebration together. That photo haunted me during last month's reunion at his brother David's mansion in Garden District. The same marble foyer, the same crystal chandelier, but everything felt different. I stood in the doorway wearing my carefully chosen thrift store dress, navy blue with small flowers, modest and forgettable, watching Marcus's family glide through their perfect lives. "Grace, you made it," David's wife Melissa said, her smile tight as surgical thread. Her diamond earrings caught the light as she air-kissed my cheek. "We weren't sure you'd be able to afford the trip." The comment hit exactly as intended. I forced a smile. Wouldn't miss it. Marcus's sister Jennifer approached with her husband, Paul, both holding crystal glasses of champagne that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. At least, that's what they thought. "How are you managing, Grace?" Jennifer asked, her voice dripping with practiced sympathy. "Still working at the diner." "Among other places," I replied quietly. "Keeping busy." Paul chuckled, not bothering to lower his voice. 3 jobs, and still broke. Marcus always was too generous for his own good. They moved away, but their whispers followed them like perfume. I caught fragments. "Poor thing, never learned to manage money." Marcus's charity case, each word was a small blade, precise and poisoned. I found refuge near the window, watching their children play in the manicured garden, designer clothes, private school confidence, summer camps in Europe, everything Marcus and I had dreamed of giving our own children someday. "She's gotten so thin," I heard Melissa whisper to another relative. "Probably can't afford to eat properly." The truth was, I'd lost weight from stress, not hunger. But I let them believe their cruel narrative. I'd been playing this role for so long, it had become second nature. David approached with his bourbon, loosened by alcohol and emboldened by audience. "Grace, we've been talking. The family's been thinking it might be time for you to move somewhere more affordable, maybe get some training for a better job." "I'm managing fine," I said evenly. "Are you, though?" He gestured around the room. "Look at this. Marcus built something here." "We all did. But you," he shook his head. "You're still living in that same little house, working minimum wage jobs. It's been 15 years, Grace. Maybe it's time to accept reality." Reality. If only he knew what reality actually looked like. Jennifer joined us, her expression calculating. "We're not being cruel, Grace. We're being practical. Marcus would want you to be realistic about your situation." "Don't," I said quietly. "Don't tell me what Marcus would want." The room fell silent around us. For a moment, my mask slipped, and they saw something that made them step back. But then, I composed myself, became the struggling widow again. "I should go," I said. "Early shift tomorrow." As I gathered my Persa-worn leather bag, I'd bought specifically for occasions like this, I caught their reflection in the hallway. Mirror, smug satisfaction, relief that the embarrassing poor relation was leaving. "Poor Grace," I heard Jennifer sigh as I reached the door. "She just doesn't understand how the world works." I drove home in my 15-year-old Honda, another carefully maintained prop in my performance, but inside, I was burning, not with shame, with anticipation. Because in 3 days, Agent Rodriguez would call, and their perfect little world would start crumbling. The photo on my dresser smiled back at me as I changed out of my costume. Marcus's eyes, bright with love and secrets I was only beginning to understand. Soon, baby, I whispered to his image. Soon, they'll know exactly who they've been underestimating. Marcus's final letter sits in my jewelry box, folded and refolded so many times the creases have worn soft. His handwriting, careful and precise like everything he did, fills 2 pages with words that once brought comfort but now carry darker implications. My dearest Grace, it begins. By the time you read this, I'll be on my way to help with the hurricane relief efforts. I know you worry, but this is what I do. I fix things that are broken. I was 23 when I met Marcus Williams at a coffee shop near Tulane. He was 28, finishing his master's in environmental engineering, all serious eyes and gentle hands. He noticed me struggling with my laptop and offered to help, his voice soft with that slight accent that marked him as old New Orleans money. But Marcus wasn't like his family, where they were flashy and demanding. He was thoughtful and quiet, where they threw money around to show their status. He talked about building something meaningful. I want to help rebuild the Gulf Coast properly, he told me on our 3rd date, his eyes bright with passion. Not just patch things up, but create something sustainable. Something that will protect families like yours. My family had lived in the lower 9th Ward for 3 generations. We'd weathered storms before, but barely. Marcus understood that in a way his privileged siblings never could. He saw the inequality, the way some neighborhoods got protection while others were left vulnerable. Our courtship was quiet, almost secretive. He'd pick me up in his modest sedan at the BMW. His family expected him to drive on. We'd explore the city's hidden corners, jazz clubs in Treem, late-night diners in the Bywater, bookstores in the quarter where we'd spend hours reading to each other. You're different from them, I told him once, after a particularly tense dinner with his family. I hope so, he replied, squeezing my hand. I want to be better than what I came from. We married in a simple ceremony at St. Louis Cathedral, my grandmother's pearl necklace, my only jewelry. His family's polite applause barely masking their disappointment. I wasn't their choice, not wealthy enough, not connected enough, not polished enough for their vision of Marcus's future. But Marcus had his own plans. While working for established engineering firms during the day, he spent evenings building his own consulting practice. He specialized in environmental restoration projects, particularly in vulnerable coastal communities. The money's in prevention, he explained, showing me complex charts and projections on his laptop. If we can convince developers and municipalities to invest in proper infrastructure before disaster strikes, we save lives and money. His business grew quickly. Too quickly, I realize now. Government contracts, private development deals, projects spanning from Louisiana to Florida. He traveled constantly, always with that worn leather briefcase filled with documents I never thought to examine. Trust me, Grace, he'd say when I asked about the long hours, the mysterious phone calls, the cash payments that sometimes arrived by courier. I'm building something for us, something that will set us up for life. The night before he left for the hurricane relief efforts, we sat on our small porch, drinking wine and watching the storm clouds gather in the distance. The air felt electric, charged with the approaching violence. I have to go, he said, though I hadn't asked him to stay. People are going to need help, and I know the infrastructure down there. I know where the weak points are. He pulled me close, and I felt the familiar comfort of his arms around me. He smelled like soap and that cologne I'd bought him for his birthday, mixed with something else, attention I couldn't identify. If something happens to me, he started. Don't, I interrupted. Don't talk like that. If something happens, he continued gently, you'll be okay. I've made sure of that. Everything I've built, everything I've worked for, it's all for you. But Grace, he pulled back to look at me seriously. If anyone ever asks questions about my work, about the business, you don't know anything. You understand. You're just my wife who loved me. That's all. I should have asked more questions then, should have demanded to know what he meant, why his voice carried that note of fear. But I was 25 and in love, and I trusted him completely. I love you, he whispered against my hair. Whatever happens, remember that everything I did was for us. He left before dawn, kissing me goodbye while I was still half asleep. The last thing he said was, take care of yourself, Grace. You're stronger than you know. I found the letter on the kitchen table when I woke up, propped against the coffee maker with my name written in his careful script. Inside, along with his words of love and encouragement, was a key I'd never seen before and an address written on a small piece of paper. This is for emergencies only, the letter explained. If something happens to me, if you ever truly need help, go to this address. But Grace only, if you have no other choice. Promise me. I kept that promise for 15 years, even when the bills piled up, even when his family turned their backs on me, even when I wondered if I was going crazy from grief and isolation. The key stayed hidden in my jewelry box, next to his wedding ring and the pearl necklace that had belonged to my grandmother. But now Agent Rodriguez had called, and I had a feeling that emergency Marcus had prepared for was finally here. As I held his letter in my hands, reading his words about fixing broken things, I couldn't help but wonder what had my husband broken that still needed fixing all these years later. Marcus's wallet came back to me waterlogged and warped, leather cracked like broken earth. Inside, his driver's license was barely readable, the ink smeared into ghostly impressions, but tucked behind his credit cards were business cards I'd never seen before, companies with names like Gulf Coast Restoration Partners and Sustainable Delta Solutions, all with Marcus's name printed in elegant script. August 29, 2005. Date is burned into my memory like a brand. I woke up that morning to the sound of wind that didn't sound natural, a howling that seemed to come from the earth itself. Marcus had been gone for 3 days, working with emergency teams to reinforce levees and evacuate vulnerable areas. Our little house in mid-city shuddered with each gust. I'd wanted to evacuate, but Marcus had insisted I'd be safer inland than trying to travel in the storm. "Stay put, baby," he'd said in our last phone conversation. "I'll come get you as soon as this passes." The power went out at 7 a.m. I sat in our living room, listening to my battery-powered radio, trying to piece together what was happening. Reports came in fragments, wind speeds, storm surge warnings, mandatory evacuations, but nothing prepared me for what came next. The levees failed at 9:38 a.m. I didn't know it then. I was huddled in our interior hallway, following the safety protocols Marcus had drilled into me, when I heard the sound that still visits my nightmares, a low rumble that grew into a roar, like the earth itself was tearing apart. My phone rang once more at 10:15. Marcus's voice came through clear but strained. "Grace, listen to me carefully. The Industrial Canal levee has breached. The 9th Ward is flooding fast. Are you okay?" I could barely hear myself over the wind. "I'm at the breach point with the emergency team. We're trying to get people out." But his voice cut off, replaced by shouting in the background. When he came back, his words were rushed. "Grace, if something happens to me, remember what I told you. Remember the address. Remember that I love you." "Marcus, you're scaring me. There's a family trapped in their attic on Rain Street. They have 2 little kids. I have 2. The line went dead. I called back 17 times. Each attempt went straight to voicemail, his calm voice telling me to leave a message, that he'd get back to me soon. Each time, my panic grew more desperate. The radio painted an increasingly horrific picture. 80% of New Orleans was underwater. The Superdome was in chaos. Thousands were stranded on rooftops. And somewhere in that devastation was my husband, trying to save strangers while I sat safe and helpless in our dry house. I didn't sleep for 3 days. I called every hospital, every emergency center, every relief organization I could find. Marcus's name wasn't on any list. Not injured, not evacuated, not sheltered. He had simply vanished into the storm. On September 2nd, Officer Martinez came to my door. I knew before he spoke. It was in his eyes, the careful way he removed his hat, the gentle tone he used to ask if he could come inside. "Mrs. Williams, I'm sorry to inform you that we've recovered your husband's body." The words hit me like physical blows. Recovered, body, past tense, final. "He was found in the lower 9th Ward," Martinez continued. "According to witnesses, he helped evacuate a family from their flooded home. He went back for an elderly man who was trapped, but the current..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "He was swept away. The man he was trying to save didn't make it either." Marcus had died doing exactly what he'd lived for, protecting the vulnerable, fixing what was broken, but knowing that didn't make the grief any easier to bear. The wallet came back 3 weeks later, delivered by a FEMA worker who found it tangled in debris near the breach site. Most of its contents were destroyed, but those business cards survived, protected by the wallet's inner pocket. I stared at them for hours, trying to understand. Gulf Coast Restoration Partners, Sustainable Delta Solutions, Environmental Futures LLC, company names I'd never heard Marcus mention. all claiming him as a principal or managing partner. When I called the numbers on the cards, I got answering services for businesses I couldn't find in any directory. When I searched online, I found professional websites for companies that seemed to exist only in digital space, impressive logos, vague mission statements, contact forms that led nowhere. Who were you really, Marcus? I whispered to his photo that night, but the silence in our empty house gave me no answers. The insurance payout was smaller than I'd expected. Marcus had changed his life insurance policy just months before his death, reducing the benefit by more than half. When I asked the agent why, she could only tell me that the change had been Marcus's specific request. He said you wouldn't need as much as originally planned, she explained. He seemed confident you'd be well provided for through other means. But what other means? Our savings account held barely enough to cover the funeral expenses. Our checking account was almost empty. The mysterious companies on his business cards seemed to have dissolved into thin air. As I sat in our quiet house, surrounded by Marcus's belongings and haunted by his secrets, I made a decision that would shape the next 15 years of my life. If my husband had left me riddles instead of answers, if his family looked at me with pity and suspicion, if the world expected me to be a broken widow struggling to survive, then that's exactly what I would be. But deep down, beneath the grief and confusion, I held on to Marcus's final words. Remember the address. Remember that I love you. Someday, when I was ready, I would use that key he'd left me. Someday, I would understand what my husband had really been building in the shadows. I just never imagined it would take the FBI to help me find out. Marcus's will sat on the mahogany table like an accusation, its pages crisp and formal in the lawyer's sterile conference room. Around me, the Williams family arranged themselves in expensive suits and carefully composed expressions of grief, but I could feel their anticipation crackling beneath the surface, like electricity before a storm. The funeral had been a performance worthy of Broadway, St. Louis Cathedral filled with flowers that cost more than most people's monthly salary, organ music that echoed off the vaulted ceiling, and a eulogy delivered by David that painted Marcus as a devoted son and brother while barely mentioning his wife of 5 years. Marcus always put family first, David had said, his voice carrying perfectly to the back pews. He understood the importance of legacy, of building something lasting for those he loved. I sat in the front row in my black dress, the only truly expensive thing I owned, a gift from Marcus on our anniversary, and watched his family perform their grief. Jennifer dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Melissa clutched David's arm dramatically. Even Marcus's elderly Aunt Louise managed a few theatrical sighs, but their tears dried remarkably quickly when it came time for the will reading. Before we begin, Mr. Fontaine, the family lawyer, adjusted his glasses and looked at each of us in turn. I want to note that Marcus made several changes to his estate planning in the months before his death. These changes were made independently, without consultation with family members. David leaned forward in his chair. What kind of changes? We'll get to that, Fontaine replied diplomatically. He cleared his throat and began reading. I, Marcus, David Williams, being of sound mind and body, do hereby make this my last will and testament. The language was formal, full of legal terms that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. But the essential facts were simple enough. Marcus had left me the house, his personal belongings, and a modest savings account containing $18,000. That's it. Jennifer's voice cracked with disbelief. What about the business? What about his investments? Fontaine flipped through the pages. According to this document, Mr. Williams's business interests were dissolved prior to his death. The consulting firm was closed, all contracts were completed, and any remaining assets were distributed. Distributed to whom? David demanded. The will doesn't specify. These transactions appear to have been handled separately from the estate. I watched the family's faces change as the reality sank in. They'd expected to inherit Marcus's mysterious wealth, his successful consulting business, his portfolio of lucrative government contracts. Instead, they were looking at a modest estate that barely covered the funeral expenses. This doesn't make sense, David said, standing up abruptly. Marcus was making serious money. We all knew it. Where did it go? All eyes turned to me. I felt their suspicion like heat from a flame, and I played my part perfectly, the confused widow who knew nothing about her husband's business affairs. I don't understand any of this, I said quietly, which was true enough. Marcus never talked to me about his work. He said he wanted to protect me from the stress of it. Protect you? Jennifer's voice rose. Grace, you were his wife. You had to know something. I knew he worked hard. I knew he traveled. I knew he was trying to build something for our future. I looked down at my hands, letting my voice break. Slightly, I thought he was successful. But maybe I was wrong. The room fell silent, except for the tick of Fontaine's antique clock. I could feel their disappointment, their frustration, their growing resentment. They'd expected to be Marcus's heirs. And instead they were looking at a woman who'd inherited almost nothing and who therefore had nothing to share with them. There has to be more, David said finally. Life insurance, retirement accounts, something. Fontaine consulted another document. There was a life insurance policy, but Mr. Williams reduced the benefits significantly just 3 months before his death. The payout was $40,000, which went directly to Mrs. Williams, as the beneficiary. Reduced it. Melissa spoke for the first time. Why would he do that? The insurance company has no record of his reasoning, Fontaine replied, but the change was made voluntarily and in writing. I felt their stares like physical weight. In their minds, I could see the narrative forming the gold-digging wife who'd somehow convinced Marcus to leave his family with nothing. The fact that I'd received so little myself only made them more suspicious. If Marcus had hidden his wealth somewhere, they assumed I must know where. After the meeting, they gathered in the parking lot outside Fontaine's office, their voices carrying in the humid New Orleans air. I lingered by my car, pretending to search for my keys while I listened. She's lying, Jennifer said flatly. She has to know something. Even if she does, what can we do about it? David's frustration was evident. The will is legal. Fontaine confirmed it. We could contest it. On what grounds? That Marcus loved his wife more than his siblings. Paul, Jennifer's husband, spoke up. Maybe we're looking at this wrong. Maybe Marcus really did lose his money. Maybe the business failed and he was too proud to tell anyone. No, David shook his head. I saw the contracts he was working on. Federal money, private development deals, millions of dollars in projects. That money went somewhere. They talked for another 10 minutes, speculating about hidden accounts, secret investments, offshore holdings. They talked about hiring investigators, about pressuring me for information, about watching my spending to see if I was living beyond my apparent means. But in the end, they did nothing. Because what could they do? The will was clear, the estate was settled, and Marcus's business affairs had vanished like smoke. If there were secrets to uncover, they were buried as deeply as Marcus himself. I drove home alone, past the cemetery where we'd laid Marcus to rest just hours before. The weight of their suspicion followed me, but it wasn't entirely unpleasant. Let them wonder, let them watch and speculate and resent. Their attention would only make my performance more convincing. That night, I sat in Marcus's study, surrounded by his books and papers, holding the key he'd left me. The address was memorized by now, burned into my mind like a prayer. Somewhere across town, in a place I'd never been, lay answers to questions I was afraid to ask, but not yet. I wasn't ready yet. First, I had to become the person they expected me to be. The struggling widow, the burden, the embarrassment. I had to make them comfortable with dismissing me, with turning their backs on me, with forgetting I existed. Because, when the time finally came for truth to surface, I wanted them to be completely unprepared for what it would reveal. The pile of unopened bills on my kitchen counter told a story of desperation that wasn't entirely fiction. Medical bills from Marcus's final hospital stay, mortgage statements with late fees highlighted in red, utility shut-off notices etched envelope, carefully selected and arranged to paint the picture of a widow drowning in debt. What the Williams family didn't know was that most of these bills had already been paid. The mortgage was current, the utilities were on, and the medical debt had been settled months ago through channels they couldn't trace. But the envelopes made excellent props, and I'd learned to arrange them strategically whenever David or Jennifer made their increasingly rare visits. The abandonment began slowly, like watching water drain from a tub. At first, in the weeks after the funeral, they maintained the pretense of family support. Jennifer would call once a week, her voice bright with artificial concern. "How are you managing, Grace? Do you need anything?" "I'm getting by," I'd reply, letting just enough weariness creep into my voice. "It's hard, but I'm managing." "Well, you know we're here, if you need us." But they weren't, really. When I mentioned struggling to pay for Marcus's headstone, the silence on the phone stretched long enough to hear their discomfort. When I talked about taking a second job at the diner downtown, their responses became shorter, more distant. The truth was, I didn't need their help. Marcus had left me far from destitute, though not in ways his family could understand. The 18,000 in our joint account was just the visible tip of something much larger and more complex, but playing the struggling widow served my purposes perfectly. I took the job at Mel's Diner on Magazine Street, working the breakfast shift from 5 a.m. to noon. The work was hard, standing for hours, dealing with demanding customers, smelling like bacon grease by the end of every shift, but it provided the perfect cover story. When David called to check on me, I could honestly say I was working. "Grace, you sound exhausted," he said during one of our conversations, about 6 months after the funeral. "2 jobs will do that to you," I replied, letting my voice crack slightly. "But I don't have much choice." "What's the other job?" "Cleaning offices downtown. Evening shift." This was true. I'd taken the position specifically to explain my busy schedule and modest spending. "It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills." The cleaning job was perfect for my purposes. It got me out of the house at predictable times, provided legitimate income I could report, and gave me access to downtown New Orleans after business hours. More importantly, it established a pattern of financial struggle that Marcus's family found both believable and uncomfortable. Their discomfort manifested in gradual withdrawal. Phone calls became less frequent. Invitations to family gatherings stopped coming. When I did encounter them at the grocery store, at church, at the occasional funeral or wedding, their greetings became perfunctory, their smiles strained. "Grace, we never see you anymore," Melissa said when we crossed paths at Whole Foods. Her cart was full of organic produce and expensive wine. Mine contained generic brands and markdown meat. "I've been busy with work," I replied, noticing how her eyes catalogued my thrift store outfit and discount groceries. Of course, while you take care of yourself." She hurried away before I could respond, clearly eager to end the encounter. It was becoming a pattern. They felt guilty about my circumstances, but not guilty enough to actually help. It was easier to avoid me than to confront their own indifference. By the first anniversary of Marcus's death, the family had effectively written me off. I wasn't invited to the memorial dinner David organized. I learned about it through a mutual friend who mentioned seeing the whole Williams clan at Commander's Palace, toasting Marcus's memory. "They didn't invite you?" she asked, shocked. "I'm sure it was an oversight," I replied, but we both knew better. The exclusion stung more than I'd expected. Despite everything, despite the role I was playing and the secrets I was keeping, part of me had genuinely hoped Marcus's family would embrace me as one of their own. The realization that they viewed me as a burden, an embarrassment, a reminder of their brother's poor judgment that hurt in ways I hadn't anticipated. But their rejection also freed me. With no family obligations, no social expectations, I could focus entirely on my performance. I became the perfect, struggling widow, humble, hardworking, invisible. I shopped at discount stores, drove my aging Honda, lived quietly in my modest house. I was exactly what they expected me to be. The irony wasn't lost on me. By abandoning me, the Williams family had given me the greatest gift possible: complete freedom to operate without their scrutiny. They'd stopped watching me, stopped caring about my daily activities, stopped wondering how I was managing to survive on minimum wage jobs. They had no idea that 3 evenings a week, after my cleaning shift ended, I drove to a storage facility in Metairie, where I used Marcus's key to access a unit filled with filing cabinets, computer equipment, and financial records that would have shocked them speechless. They didn't know about the offshore accounts, the complex web of shell companies, or the careful system Marcus had established to launder money through fake environmental projects. They couldn't imagine that their broke widow sister-in-law was actually sitting on a fortune that dwarfed their combined inheritances. They had no clue that while they sipped champagne at family gatherings, complaining about my poverty and their brother's poor judgment, I was methodically learning everything about the criminal empire Marcus had built, and they had helped him operate. But I wasn't ready to use that knowledge yet. I was still learning, still understanding the full scope of what Marcus had created. And I was waiting for the right moment, the perfect opportunity to reveal the truth about who I really was. That opportunity would come, I knew. Patience was something I'd learned well during my years of performance, and when the time was right, when the Williams family least expected it, they would discover that the broke widow they'd dismissed and abandoned had been playing a much longer game than they'd ever imagined. The receipt from the Goodwill store on Carrollton Avenue is still tucked in my wallet. Faded but readable, women's dress, size 8, navy blue, $4.99. It's dated 3 years ago, but I've kept it as a reminder of how carefully I constructed my poverty. Every purchase, every public appearance, every interaction was calculated to reinforce the image of Grace Williams, the struggling widow who couldn't afford to shop anywhere but thrift stores. The performance became an art form. I studied the mannerisms of genuine financial hardship, the way people counted change carefully, the hesitation before buying name-brand items, the practiced eye for clearance tags and discount schedules. I learned to clip coupons, not because I needed to save money, but because it was what the Williams family expected to see. My wardrobe became a carefully curated collection of second-hand clothes, each piece chosen to suggest just the right level of dignified poverty. The navy dress with small flowers that I wore to family gatherings came from a consignment shop in the French Quarter. The worn leather purse I carried was a genuine vintage piece I'd bought at an estate sale, then deliberately scuffed and stained to look like it had seen better days. I practiced the subtle art of appearing grateful for small kindnesses. When Jennifer occasionally remembered to invite me to lunch, I'd insist on meeting at casual places and order the cheapest items on the menu. I'd make a show of leaving exact change, plus a modest tip, never enough to seem comfortable but never so little as to appear rude. "Grace, you don't have to count every penny," Jennifer said once, watching me carefully divide my change at a cafe in the Garden District. "Old habits," I replied with a sheepish smile. "When money's tight, you learn to be careful." The social media aspect required the most delicate touch. I created a Facebook profile that told my story in carefully arranged snapshots, photos of my small house with its modest furnishings, pictures of me in work uniforms, inspirational quotes about perseverance and making ends meet. I tagged myself at discount grocery stores, posted about finding great deals at thrift shops, shared articles about budgeting and financial survival. The comments from Marcus's family members were telling. "Stay strong, Grace," from Jennifer. "Thinking of you," from David. Empty encouragement that cost them nothing and committed them to less, but it was the silence that spoke loudest. No offers of help, no invitations to family dinners, no suggestions that maybe they could assist their deceased brother's widow in her time of need. My careful performance of poverty had given them permission to ignore me completely. The most challenging part was maintaining the facade during unexpected encounters. Once, I ran into David's wife Melissa at Whole Foods while I was shopping for ingredients for a dinner party I was hosting for potential investors, sophisticated people who would have seen through my thrift store persona in seconds. "Grace." Melissa's voice carried that particular tone of surprise people use when they encounter someone they'd rather avoid. "Fancy seeing you here." I looked down at my cart, filled with expensive cheeses, organic vegetables, and a bottle of wine that cost more than my supposed weekly grocery budget. For a moment, panic fluttered in my chest. "I'm catering a small event," I said quickly. "The family I clean for sometimes pays me extra to help with entertaining." It was a plausible lie, and Melissa accepted it without question. She wanted to believe it, wanted to maintain her comfortable image of me as the struggling domestic worker who occasionally got thrown a bone by generous employers. The psychological toll of the performance was something I hadn't anticipated. Living below your means by choice is one thing. It's a form of financial discipline, even virtue. But performing poverty, especially when surrounded by people who could help but choose not to, creates a particular kind of exhaustion. I found myself genuinely forgetting, sometimes, that the struggle wasn't real. Walking through the grocery store, I'd catch myself automatically reaching for generic brands, hesitating over purchases I could easily afford. The persona I'd created began to feel like a second skin, sometimes more real than the truth underneath. The isolation was real too. While Marcus's family had abandoned me, my performance of poverty kept me from forming genuine new relationships. How do you explain to potential friends that you're pretending to be poor? How do you date when your entire public identity is built on a lie? I became an expert at deflecting social invitations. "I wish I could join you for dinner, but I'm working a double shift." "That sounds wonderful, but I'm trying to save money right now. Maybe next time, when things are less tight." Eventually, people stopped asking. I became known as Grace, the hardworking widow, the woman who was always busy, always struggling, always just getting by. It was exactly the reputation I'd cultivated, but the loneliness was a price I hadn't fully calculated. The only relief came during my evening visits to Marcus's storage unit, surrounded by the filing cabinets full of financial records, the computer equipment that held the keys to offshore accounts, the evidence of the vast criminal enterprise my husband had operated. I could drop the mask and remember who I really was, not Grace, the poor widow, but Grace, the woman who was sitting on millions of dollars in laundered money, not the abandoned sister-in-law, but the person who held the power to destroy the Williams family's carefully constructed world. Those hours in the storage unit became sacred time. I'd sit at Marcus's desk, studying the intricate web of shell companies and fake contracts he'd created, learning the names of his co-conspirators, understanding the full scope of the environmental fraud scheme that had made him and, by extension, me wealthy beyond the Williams family's wildest dreams. But knowledge without the right moment to use it is just potential energy. I was still waiting for the perfect catalyst, the event that would allow me to drop my performance and reveal the truth. I knew it would come eventually. Marcus had been too careless, too confident, too willing to trust the wrong people. What I didn't know was that the catalyst would come in the form of an FBI agent with tired eyes and a patient voice, calling me on a Tuesday morning to ask questions about a husband whose secrets were finally ready to surface. The offshore account statement lay spread across Agent Rodriguez's desk like a roadmap to hell, each line item a testament to my husband's criminal genius. Cayman Islands International Bank, the header read POL, followed by numbers that made my head spin. $3.2 million in the primary account, $1.8 million in secondary holdings, $4.7 million in investment portfolios, all of it tied to Marcus Williams, environmental engineer and loving husband. My Marcus, who died saving strangers in Hurricane Katrina. Mrs. Williams, I need you to understand the gravity of what we've discovered, Agent Rodriguez said, his voice gentle but firm. He was younger than I'd expected when he'd called that Tuesday morning, maybe 35, with kind eyes that had probably seen too much. Your husband wasn't just running a consulting business, he was operating one of the most sophisticated money laundering schemes we've encountered in the Gulf Coast region. I stared at the papers, my hands trembling slightly. It wasn't entirely an act learning. The full scope of Marcus's crimes was genuinely shocking, even after 15 years of studying his records. I don't understand. Marcus helped communities prepare for environmental disasters. He saved lives. He did some legitimate work, yes, but he also created a network of shell companies that existed only on paper. These companies would win government contracts for environmental restoration projects that were never completed, or completed so poorly they were essentially useless. Rodriguez spread out more documents and corporation papers for companies I'd found in Marcus's storage unit, government contracts bearing his signature, invoices for work that existed only in carefully fabricated reports. Gulf Coast Restoration Partners, he read from one document, supposed to reinforce wetlands protection in St. Bernard Parish. Contract value, $2.3 million. Actual work completed, minimal grading and some decorative plantings that washed away in the first storm season. My stomach lurched, but people trusted him. Communities depended on his work. That's what made the scheme so effective. Your husband had legitimate credentials and a reputation for caring about environmental protection. He used that reputation to gain access to federal disaster relief funds, state environmental grants, and private foundation money. Rodriguez pulled out a thick folder. Environmental Futures LLC, Sustainable Delta Solutions, Coastal Resilience Partners, at least 15 companies, all registered to different addresses, all ultimately controlled by Marcus. The money would come in for legitimate sounding projects, get processed through multiple accounts to obscure the trail, then disappear into offshore holdings. How much money are we talking about? I asked, though I already knew the answer from my years of studying Marcus's records. Conservative estimates, $12 to $15 million over 8 years. But here's the thing, Mrs. Williams, your husband didn't work alone. This kind of operation requires inside knowledge, political connections, and ongoing cooperation from multiple parties. My breath caught. What do you mean? The contracts Marcus received weren't random. They were steered to his companies by people with influence over the bidding process. The inspections that should have caught the substandard work were either delayed, corrupted, or waived entirely. Someone with significant power was protecting this operation. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, studying my face. We believe your husband was the operational head of a much larger conspiracy. The question is whether he was the mastermind or just the most visible component. I still don't understand how I fit into this, I said carefully. Marcus never told me about any of this. I thought he was just successful at his regular consulting work. According to our financial analysis, you're the primary beneficiary of your husband's criminal enterprise. As his widow, you legally inherited everything he owned, including the proceeds from money laundering activities. The words hit me like cold water. For 15 years, I'd been sitting on a fortune built from fraud and theft. Money that should have gone to protecting vulnerable communities from environmental disasters. Money that could have saved lives if it had been used properly. Mrs. Williams, Rodriguez continued, I need to be clear about your situation. Under federal law, you could be prosecuted for money laundering, conspiracy, and tax evasion, even if you didn't actively participate in the crimes. The fact that you benefited from the proceeds makes you legally culpable. But I believe you didn't know the full extent of your husband's activities while he was alive. Your financial behavior over the past 15 years supports that. You've lived modestly, worked regular jobs, showed no signs of accessing hidden wealth. That pattern suggests genuine ignorance rather than criminal partnership. I felt a flutter of hope. So I'm not in trouble. That depends on your willingness to cooperate with our investigation. We believe your husband's co-conspirators are still active, still stealing money meant for environmental protection. We need your help to identify them and recover the stolen funds. Rodriguez pulled out another document, a cooperation agreement with the FBI. In exchange for your assistance, we're prepared to offer you immunity from prosecution. You'll be allowed to keep a portion of the recovered assets enough to live comfortably but not luxuriously. The rest will be returned to the communities your husband defrauded. I stared at the agreement, my mind racing. For 15 years, I'd been preparing for this moment without knowing it. I'd studied Marcus's records, learned his methods, identified his associates. I knew exactly who had helped him steal millions from hurricane victims and environmental programs. And some of those co-conspirators shared his last name. What kind of cooperation are you looking for? I asked. We need you to help us understand the full scope of the operation. We need access to any records your husband might have left, and we may need you to make contact with his former associates to gather evidence. I thought about the storage unit filled with Marcus's files, the detailed records of every transaction, every fake project, every corrupted contract. I thought about the Williams family, living in luxury while communities remained vulnerable to storms, believing themselves safe because they'd never been directly connected to Marcus's front companies. Agent Rodriguez, I said quietly, there's something you should know. I may have been ignorant about Marcus's crimes while he was alive, but I haven't been ignorant for the past 15 years. His eyebrows rose. What do you mean? I mean, I've been studying his records for over a decade. I know exactly how the operation worked, who was involved, and where the money went. And I'm ready to tell you everything. For the first time since he'd started explaining Marcus's crimes, Agent Rodriguez smiled. Mrs. Williams, I think you and I are going to work very well together. The encrypted hard drive sat between us on Agent Rodriguez's desk like a ticking bomb, its black surface reflecting the fluorescent lights of the FBI field office. I'd carried it with me from Marcus's storage unit that morning, along with 3 boxes of financial records that represented 15 years of hidden truth. This contains everything, I told Rodriguez, my voice steadier than I felt. Marcus was meticulous about record keeping. Every transaction, every fake invoice, every communication with his co-conspirators, it's all here. Rodriguez called in his computer forensics team, and I watched them work with the careful precision of surgeons. The hard drive had been encrypted, with military-grade security, but Marcus had been thorough in other ways too. He'd left me the passwords, hidden in a letter I'd found in his safety deposit box years ago. The encryption key is Gray Smile of 2005, I said, feeling a strange mix of tenderness and betrayal. Even in his criminal enterprise, Marcus had made me the key to everything. As the files began to populate on the screen, Rodriguez let out a low whistle. Jesus Christ, this is incredible. The scope of the operation was staggering when displayed in neat digital folders. Marcus had organized everything by year, by project, by co-conspirator. There were contracts for environmental restoration work throughout Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. There were bank records showing money flowing through dozens of shell companies. There were emails coordinating the fraud, photographs of work sites where minimal effort had been made to justify millions in payments. "Look at this," Rodriguez said, opening a folder labeled St. Bernard Parish, Wetlands Protection. Contract value $3.2 million. Actual expenditures $180,000 for equipment rental and materials. Profit margin 94%. I leaned over his shoulder to read the details. The contract had been awarded to Coastal Resilience Partners, one of Marcus's shell companies, for comprehensive wetlands restoration and storm surge barriers. The work described in the final report was extensive new levees, reinforced drainage systems, native plant restoration across 500 acres. But it was never done, I said, remembering the site visits I'd made years ago while trying to understand Marcus's work. I drove out there once. There's nothing but a few ditches and some decorative plants. Exactly when Hurricane Katrina hit in 2008, that entire area flooded because the protection systems that were supposed to be there didn't exist. Rodriguez opened another folder, then another. Each told the same story: communities paying for environmental protection they never received. Families trusting in safety measures that were never built. Disaster relief funds disappearing into offshore accounts while people remained vulnerable. "Mrs. Williams, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Did you ever suspect your husband was involved in anything illegal?" I thought carefully about how to answer. I suspected he was hiding financial information from me. But I assumed it was because he was more successful than he wanted his family to know. Marcus came from money, but he was also proud and independent. I thought maybe he was downplaying his success to avoid family pressure or expectations. "What about after his death? When did you first realize something was wrong?" "Honestly, not. For several years, I was grieving, and I was dealing with real financial pressure, because I couldn't access his hidden accounts. It wasn't until I found his storage unit that I began to understand the scope of what he'd been doing." Rodriguez pulled up a communications folder. "These emails are going to be crucial. Your husband was in regular contact with at least a dozen co-conspirators. Look at this one. From someone with the initials DW. The email was dated 3 months before Marcus's death. M. The Plaquemines contract is approved. Our contact at the parish level made sure the bidding process was expedited. You should have the paperwork by Friday. Remember, we need to keep the visible work to a minimum while maximizing the invoicing. The storm season is coming, and we need to have everything processed before the scrutiny increases." DW. My blood turned cold. DW. Those are my brother-in-law's initials. David Williams, your husband's brother. Yes, David worked for the parish development office. He would have had access to the bidding process for environmental contracts. Rodriguez pulled up another email, this one from JW. M. Melissa's contact at the state environmental office confirmed the inspection schedule. You'll have at least 6 weeks before anyone visits the Lafourche Parish site. That should be plenty of time to establish a minimal presence and document it for the completion report. Jennifer Williams, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Marcus's sister, she's married to Paul, who works for the state environmental department. "Mrs. Williams, what I'm seeing here suggests your husband was the operational head of a family business, a criminal family business." The implications hit me like a physical blow. For 15 years, I'd endured their condescension, their abandonment, their whispered comments about my poverty, and their brother's poor judgment, all while they were living on money stolen from the very communities Marcus had claimed to protect. "They knew," I said, anger building in my chest. "They knew what Marcus was doing, and they knew where the money was, when they couldn't find it. After his death, they assumed I was hiding it from them. That would explain their behavior toward you. They weren't just disappointed about missing out on an inheritance, they were angry about losing access to an ongoing criminal enterprise." Rodriguez opened more files, revealing a network of corruption that extended far beyond the Williams family. Local politicians, state environmental officials, federal inspectors, banking executives, dozens of people had been involved in this scheme, each taking their cut while communities remained vulnerable. "This is going to be one of the largest environmental fraud cases in Gulf Coast history," Rodriguez said. "The amount of money involved, the number of people implicated, the impact on public safety, it's massive." I stared at the screen full of evidence, thinking about all the times David had asked me about Marcus's real assets, all the times Jennifer had hinted that I must know more than I was telling them. They'd been right, he did know more. I knew everything. Agent Rodriguez, I said, I want to help you build cases against every single person involved in this, but I have one condition. What's that? I want to be there when you arrest David and Jennifer Williams. I want to see their faces when they realize that the broke widow they've been dismissing for 15 years was the one who brought them down. Rodriguez looked at me carefully. Mrs. Williams, I understand you're angry, but this is a federal investigation, not a personal vendetta. It's both, I said firmly. Those people didn't just steal money from hurricane victims. They stole 15 years of my life, made me into a pariah, forced me to live in hiding while they enjoyed the profits from their crimes. I want justice, Agent Rodriguez, and I want to watch them get it. He was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. I think we can arrange that. Marcus's brother's business cards were scattered across the conference table like playing cards in a high-stakes game, each one representing a different piece of the conspiracy that had been hiding in plain sight for over a decade. David Williams, Senior Development Coordinator, Plockman's Parish Planning Department. Jennifer Williams Patterson, Environmental Compliance Specialist, Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality. Even Paul Patterson's card was there. Senior Inspector, Federal Environmental Protection Agency, Region 6. Your husband's entire family was involved, Agent Rodriguez said, arranging the cards chronologically. This wasn't just Marcus operating alone, this was a coordinated effort spanning multiple levels of government oversight. I picked up David's card, remembering the countless family gatherings where he'd talked about his work with such apparent passion. David always said he went into public service to make a difference, to help rebuild Louisiana after the hurricanes. I thought he was genuinely committed to environmental protection. He was committed to something. All right, Agent Rodriguez replied grimly. He pulled up an email thread on his laptop. Look at this conversation from 2003, 2 years before Katrina. David is coordinating with Marcus about upcoming environmental contracts. The emails revealed a sophisticated system of inside information sharing. David would alert Marcus to upcoming contract opportunities weeks before they were publicly announced. He'd provide details about the evaluation criteria, the budget ranges, even the names of competing bidders. In return, Marcus would ensure that a percentage of each fraudulent contract found its way back to David through carefully laundered payments. Here's how it worked, Rodriguez explained, pulling up a flowchart he'd created. David identifies a lucrative environmental contract in his parish. He tips off Marcus, who creates a shell company specifically for that bid. Jennifer uses her position at the state level to expedite the permitting process and reduce oversight. Paul, as a federal inspector, either delays his inspections or provides advance warning when they're scheduled, and Marcus does minimal work while invoicing for the full contract amount. I added, the pieces falling into place. Exactly. The money gets processed through multiple shell companies to obscure the trail, then distributed to offshore accounts controlled by various family members. Rodriguez showed me another set of documents, bank records from the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and the Bahamas. Each account was registered to a different Williams family member using slight variations of their names or their children's names. David Williams has accounts under D. Marcus Williams and Williams Family Trust. Rodriguez read, Jennifer has money in accounts registered to J. Patterson Holdings and Madison Patterson Trust. That's her daughter's name. Paul has accounts under Patterson Environmental Consulting and Gulf Coast Inspections, LLC. The scale of their wealth was staggering. David had accumulated over $4 million across his various accounts. Jennifer had nearly $3 million. Even Paul, who'd joined the conspiracy later, had managed to hide away $1.8 million. They were all living off stolen money, I said, thinking about their expensive houses, their luxury cars, their children's private schools and European vacations. Everything they have was built on fraud, and they had the audacity to look down on you for being poor, Rodriguez added. They knew exactly where Marcus's money had gone because they helped him hide it. I remembered David's comments at the family reunion, his suggestion that I should accept reality about my financial situation, the condescension in his voice, the way he gestured around his mansion as if to emphasize the contrast between his success and my apparent failure. They must have been terrified after Marcus died, I realized, not just because they'd lost their operational leader, but because they couldn't access his accounts. They needed me to either give them access or disappear entirely. Rodriguez nodded. Your continued presence was a threat to their security. As long as you were around, there was always the possibility that you'd discovered the truth about Marcus's activities. Their best-case scenario was that you'd eventually give up and move away, leaving them free to operate without worry about Marcus's widow asking uncomfortable questions. But I didn't move away. I stayed, and I worked minimum-wage jobs, and I made them feel guilty about abandoning me. Exactly. You were a constant reminder of their crimes and their callousness. No wonder they wanted nothing to do with you. Rodriguez pulled up another set of emails, these ones from after Marcus's death. The tone was notably different, paranoid, urgent, filled with coded language about cleaning up loose ends and securing our interests. Look at this one from David, sent 3 months after the funeral. Rodriguez said, G hasn't made any unusual financial moves. We think M kept her in the dark about the business side. Suggest we maintain minimal contact to avoid raising suspicions, but monitor her activities for any signs she's discovered M's records. They were watching me, I said, feeling violated. All these years, they were keeping track of what I was doing. Jennifer responds here, agreed on minimal contact. P has confirmed that federal audit schedules remain normal. No unusual interest in EMS old contracts. As long as G maintains her current lifestyle, we should be safe to resume limited operations. Felt sick. While I'd been struggling with grief and isolation, while I'd been working 2 jobs and shopping at thrift stores, they'd been calculating how to protect their criminal enterprise from the inconvenience of Marcus's widow. Limited operations, I repeated. They kept stealing after Marcus died. Oh yes, the environmental fraud scheme continued for another decade. After your husband's death, they were more careful, smaller scale, but they never stopped. We estimate they stole another $8 million in environmental protection funds between 2005 and 2015. Rodriguez showed me contracts for post-Katrina reconstruction projects, post-catastrophe recovery efforts, post-catastrophe restoration work. Each disaster had been an opportunity for the Williams family to steal money meant to protect vulnerable communities. Mrs. Williams, I need you to understand something. This family didn't just steal money, they stole safety. Communities that trusted in environmental protections that were never built. Families who thought they were safe from storm surge because levees were supposed to have been reinforced. People died because of what your husband's family did. The weight of it settled on me like a physical burden. Marcus's death had been tragic, but at least he'd died trying to save people. His family had spent the next 15 years actively endangering the same communities Marcus had claimed to protect. What happens now? I asked. Now we build cases against each of them. We use Marcus's records, their own communications, and financial evidence to prove their involvement in the conspiracy. And Mrs. Williams, we're going to need your help to gather some final pieces of evidence. What kind of help? Rodriguez leaned forward, his expression serious. We need you to make contact with them. We need you to get them talking about the old days, about Marcus's work, about their knowledge of his business activities. We need them to incriminate themselves on tape. I thought about the family reunion, about their whispered comments and condescending smiles, about 15 years of being treated like a burden, an embarrassment, a reminder of their brother's poor judgment. Agent Rodriguez, I said, I would be delighted to help you get them talking. The wire recording device was smaller than I'd expected, no bigger than a matchbook, with adhesive backing that would stick to my skin beneath my clothes. Agent Rodriguez demonstrated how to activate it with a simple press of a button, disguised as a decorative clasp on my blouse. Remember, Mrs. Williams, we need clear admissions of knowledge about the fraudulent contracts. We need them to acknowledge their roles in the conspiracy. Most importantly, we need them to discuss specific details that only someone involved in the crimes would know. I sat in the FBI preparation room, practicing my lines like an actress rehearsing for the performance of her life. In many ways, that's exactly what this was, the culmination of 15 years of playing a role. Except now, the stakes were federal prison sentences instead of family dynamics. The key is to seem curious, but not suspicious, Rodriguez explained. You're the grieving widow who's finally ready to learn more about her husband's work. You're not investigating, you're just trying to understand the man you married. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would call David and suggest a family gathering to commemorate the 20th anniversary of Marcus's death. I'd play the sentimental widow, wanting to reconnect with Marcus's family. wanting to hear stories about his professional life that I'd never known while he was alive. They'll be suspicious at first, Rodriguez warned. Your sudden interest in family reconciliation after years of distance will raise red flags. But if you play it right, their arrogance will overcome their caution. They'll want to control the narrative about Marcus's work. I practiced the phone call with Agent Rodriguez playing David's role. I've been thinking about Marcus a lot lately, I rehearsed. I realize I never really understood what he did for work. I was so young when we married, and he always said he wanted to protect me from the stress of his business. But now, I don't know, maybe I'm finally ready to learn about that part of his life. Good, Rodriguez said. That gives them an opening to shape what you learn. They'll want to tell you a sanitized version of Marcus's works, successful but not too successful, legitimate but not too detailed. The recording device felt strange against my skin as I made the actual call to David. My hands were steadier than I'd expected, my voice calm and wistful rather than nervous. David, it's Grace. I hope I'm not bothering you. Grace. His surprise was evident. No, not at all. Is everything okay? Everything's fine. I was just well. It's been 20 years since Marcus died, and I've been thinking about him a lot, about how little I really knew about his work, his professional life. I was wondering if maybe we could get together sometime, you and Jennifer and I, and you could tell me about that side of him. There was a long pause. I could almost hear David's mental calculations, weighing the risks and benefits of renewed contact with Marcus's widow. That's very thoughtful of you, Grace. I'm sure we'd all enjoy sharing memories of Marcus. Feel like I was so focused on my own grief for so long that I never really appreciated what he accomplished professionally. He was always so modest about his success, but I know he must have been very good at what he did. He was extremely successful, David said, warming to the topic. Marcus had a real gift for environmental engineering. He understood the political and economic aspects of the business in ways that most technical people don't. I'd love to hear more about that. Maybe we could have dinner sometime. I could cook. I know how much you and Jennifer used to enjoy my jambalaya. Another pause, shorter this time. That sounds wonderful, Grace. Let me talk to Jennifer, and we'll set something up. After I hung up, Rodriguez nodded approvingly. Perfect. You gave them exactly what they needed, a plausible reason for your sudden interest, and an opportunity to control the conversation. Over the next few days, we refined the plan. The dinner would be at my house, where the FBI could install additional recording equipment and where I would have home field advantage. I would prepare Marcus's favorite meal, creating a nostalgic atmosphere that might lower their guard. The goal is to get them talking about specific projects, Rodriguez reminded me. We need details about the Plaquemines Parish contract, the St. Bernard Wetlands project, the post-Katrina reconstruction work. We need them to admit they knew the work wasn't being done properly. I spent hours studying the case files, memorizing project names and dates, understanding the technical details well enough to ask informed questions. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was finally getting the education about Marcus's work that I'd never received while he was alive. The most challenging part was managing my own emotions. For 15 years, I'd suppressed my anger at the Williams family, channeling it into my performance of poverty and isolation. Now, with justice finally within reach, I had to be careful not to let my rage show through. Remember, Rodriguez said during one of our preparation sessions, they can't know that you know. You're not confronting them, you're gathering evidence. Your job is to make them feel safe enough to incriminate themselves. The night before the dinner, I stood in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd read Marcus's final letter, where I'd sat with his waterlogged wallet, where I'd counted fake bills to maintain my performance of poverty. Tomorrow, this room would become a stage for the final act of a drama that had been building for 2 decades. I touched the recording device beneath my blouse, feeling its slight weight against my skin. Such a small thing to carry the power to destroy lives, to expose decades of fraud, to finally balance the scales of justice. The Williams family had no idea what was coming. They thought they were having dinner with the broke widow. The family, embarrassment, the woman they'd successfully marginalized and dismissed. They had no idea they were walking into a trap set by the woman who'd been studying their crimes for 15 years, who knew their secrets better than they did, who'd been patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to strike. Tomorrow night, the performance would end. Tomorrow night, Grace Williams would finally stop pretending to be powerless and show her husband's family exactly what she'd learned about the price of betrayal. The Thanksgiving family photo sits on my mantel now. A memento of the last innocent moment before everything unraveled. In it, David and Jennifer are smiling beside me at my modest dining table, their expressions relaxed and patronizing. If you look closely, you can see the slight bulge of the recording device beneath my burgundy blouse, invisible to them but obvious to me now. "Grace, this is wonderful," Jennifer had said, surveying my small dining room with the kind of appreciation people show for quaint, inferior things. "So cozy, so authentic." I'd served Marcus's favorite jambalaya, the recipe I'd perfected during our brief marriage, accompanied by cornbread and sweet tea. The meal was deliberately nostalgic, designed to evoke memories of happier times when Marcus was alive and their criminal empire was thriving. "I can see why Marcus loved your cooking," David said, taking a generous helping. "He always said you had a gift for making simple ingredients taste special." "Simple ingredients," I repeated, letting a note of wistfulness creep into my voice. "I guess that's all I've ever been able to afford, but I'm grateful Marcus wasn't the type to demand expensive tastes." They exchanged a look across the tabla, quick flash of superiority, quickly masked by polite sympathy. In their minds, I was still the poor widow who couldn't afford quality groceries, still the burden their successful brother had saddled them with. "Marcus was always practical," Jennifer said carefully. "He understood the value of living within one's means." "I wish I understood more about his work," I said, pressing the hidden button to ensure the recording device was active. "I feel like I failed him somehow, never taking an interest in his professional life." "You didn't fail him, Grace," David said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd endured for years. "Marcus preferred to keep his work separate from his personal life. He wanted to protect you from the complexities of the business world. But he was so successful," I pressed. "Even I could see that from the contracts and payments that came through our joint account. He must have been very good at what he did." David nodded, warming to the subject. "Marcus had a real talent for understanding what clients needed. He could look at a project and see opportunities that other consultants missed." "What kind of opportunities?" "Well, for instance, he understood that environmental protection isn't just about the technical work, it's about managing relationships with regulators, understanding the political landscape, finding ways to maximize efficiency." I leaned forward, playing the interested widow. "Maximize efficiency." "Marcus realized that many environmental contracts were over-engineered," Jennifer explained. "Communities would request elaborate protection systems when simpler, more cost-effective solutions would be just as effective. He had a gift for identifying those situations, and the regulators were okay with that." David chuckled. "Marcus had excellent relationships with oversight agencies. He understood that inspectors and project managers are overworked and understaffed. If you could demonstrate that a project met its core objectives, they were usually satisfied." "Core objectives," I repeated, filing away the euphemism. "That makes sense. Marcus always said he wanted to help as many communities as possible, with the resources available." "Exactly," Jennifer said. "He could stretch a dollar further than anyone else in the business. Instead of gold-plating one project, he could provide basic protection for 3 or 4 communities." "Basic protection," I echoed. "But effective protection, of course," David said quickly. "Marcus would never compromise public safety. He just understood that perception is often as important as reality in the environmental business." "Perception?" "Well, if a community feels protected, if they see evidence of professional environmental work, that confidence itself provides a kind of security." Marcus understood the psychological component of disaster preparedness. I felt sick listening to them rationalize fraud as psychology, but I kept my expression neutral. "That's fascinating. He never explained it to me that way." "Marcus was probably trying to spare you the technical details," Jennifer said. "Environmental consulting can be very complex, especially when you're dealing with multiple jurisdictions and funding sources." "Multiple funding sources," I repeated. "That sounds complicated." "It is," David said. Marcus was brilliant at structuring projects to take advantage of different funding streams: federal disaster relief, state environmental grants, private foundation money. He could piece together financing packages that other consultants couldn't even imagine, and the different agencies didn't mind sharing projects. "Why would they?" Jennifer asked. "Everyone wants to see environmental protection succeed. If Marcus could leverage federal money to match state funds and private donations, that just meant more protection for more communities." "It sounds like he was doing important work," I said. letting admiration creep into my voice. I wish I'd understood it better while he was alive. Marcus was making a real difference, David said, his voice taking on a note of pride. The projects he worked on protected thousands of families from hurricane damage. Which projects? I asked innocently. I'd love to know specifically what he accomplished. David and Jennifer exchanged another look, this one more cautious. Well, there were so many, Jennifer said vaguely. The Plaquemines Parish levee reinforcement, the St. Bernard wetlands restoration, the post-Katrina reconstruction work. Did you ever visit those sites? I asked. I'd love to see Marcus's work firsthand. Oh, they've evolved over the years, David said quickly. Environmental projects change with the landscape. What matters is that Marcus provided the foundation for long-term protection. Foundation, I repeated, so his work is still protecting people today. In a sense, Jennifer said, Marcus's approach influenced how environmental consulting is done throughout the region. His methods are still being used by other firms. His methods, I echoed. I'm starting to understand why he was so successful. It sounds like he found ways to do more good with less money. Exactly, David said, relaxing again. Marcus understood that perfect can be the enemy of good. Instead of building one perfect levee, he could build adequate protection for multiple communities. Adequate protection, I said, savoring the phrase. That's a beautiful way to put it. We talked for another hour, with David and Jennifer painting an elaborate picture of Marcus as a visionary who'd revolutionized environmental consulting through creative efficiency and relationship management. They described a man who'd maximized impact while minimizing costs, who'd built trust with regulators through consistent delivery, who'd pioneered innovative approaches to disaster preparedness. That what they actually described, in carefully sanitized language, was a sophisticated fraud scheme that had stolen millions from vulnerable communities while providing minimal actual protection, that is, they prepared to leave. Jennifer hugged me with what seemed like genuine warmth. Grace, it means so much that you're finally ready to learn about this side of Marcus. He would be so proud to know you understand his work. I feel like I'm just beginning to understand, I said truthfully. Thank you both for sharing your memories. After they left, I sat alone in my kitchen, the recording device still warm against my skin. I thought about their casual use of euphemisms, maximizing efficiency, adequate protection, psychological security. They'd spent the evening describing criminal fraud as innovative consulting, convincing themselves that stealing disaster relief money was actually a form of community service. But they'd also given me everything Agent Rodriguez needed: admissions of knowledge about Marcus's methods, detailed descriptions of specific projects, clear acknowledgement of their roles in the oversight process. They'd incriminated themselves completely while thinking they were educating a simple widow about her husband's professional legacy. The photo on my mantel captures that moment of false intimacy. The last time the Williams family would look at me with condescension rather than fear. Tomorrow, I would turn the recording over to Agent Rodriguez, and the trap would spring shut on the people who'd spent 15 years treating me like their charity case. But tonight, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. The broke widow had finally gotten her family to tell her the truth. The federal search warrant was a work of art. 10 pages of legal language authorizing the simultaneous seizure of documents, computers, and financial records from 7 different locations across the greater New Orleans area. I held a copy in my hands as I sat in Agent Rodriguez's unmarked car, watching David's Garden District mansion from across the street at 6 a.m. on a gray December morning. Federal Bureau of Investigation, search warrant, the voice echoed through the quiet neighborhood as a dozen agents approached David's front door. I watched through binoculars as lights came on throughout the house, as curtains twitched in neighboring windows, as the carefully constructed world of Williams' family respectability began to crumble. How does it feel? Rodriguez asked, noting my intense focus on the scene unfolding before us. Like justice, I replied, watching David appear at his front door in a bathrobe, his face a mask of confusion and growing panic as agents pushed past him into the house. Through my earpiece, I could hear radio chatter from the other raid locations. Jennifer's house, in Metairie. Subject secured, beginning document seizure. Paul's condo in the French Quarter. Computer equipment located and tagged for removal. The Williams family's vacation property, in Gulf Shores. Safe, located behind master bedroom artwork, requesting specialized entry team. From my vantage point, I could see into David's living room as agents began boxing up documents from the mahogany. desk where he'd probably planned his fraudulent schemes. His wife Melissa stood in the hallway, clutching her silk robe, her face pale with shock. Their teenage children peered down from the second-floor landing, watching their privileged world collapse in real time. Grace Williams provided us with extensive documentation of your environmental consulting fraud. I heard Agent Rodriguez's voice through the radio as he spoke to David. You have the right to remain silent. I'd specifically requested to be present for this moment, and Rodriguez had agreed after some persuasion. I needed to see David's face when he realized that the broke widow he'd dismissed and abandoned had been the architect of his downfall. Through the binoculars, I watched David's expression change as the implications sank in. Confusion gave way to recognition, recognition to disbelief, disbelief to rage. He turned toward the window, toward the street, as if he could somehow sense my presence watching him. Mrs. Williams, I think it might be time for us to make our entrance, Rodriguez said. I straightened my shoulders and followed him across the street. The same marble steps I'd climbed for family gatherings, the same front door where I'd been greeted with barely concealed condescension, the same foyer where I'd been made to feel like an unwelcome charity case. Grace, David's voice cracked as he saw me enter with Agent Rodriguez. Grace, how are you? Hello, David, I said calmly. I thought you should know that I finally understand Marcus's work, all of it. The color drained from his face. Behind him, Melissa gasped as she recognized me. You, she whispered, you did this. I cooperated with a federal investigation into environmental fraud. I corrected. I provided evidence of crimes that cost communities millions in disaster protection funding. You don't understand, David started. I understand everything, I interrupted. I understand that you used your position at the parish planning office to steer contracts to Marcus's shell companies. I understand that you knew the work wasn't being completed properly. I understand that you took your cut of stolen disaster relief money while families remained vulnerable to hurricanes. Agent Rodriguez stepped forward. Mr. Williams, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and theft of federal disaster relief funds. As they read David his rights, I walked through the house I'd always found intimidating. The expensive furniture, the original artwork, the crystal chandelier that had impressed me so much during my early visits, all of it purchased with money stolen from hurricane victims. In David's study, agents were cataloging evidence that would seal his conviction. Bank statements showing transfers from shell companies, communications with Marcus about upcoming contract opportunities, detailed records of the percentage splits among family members, even vacation photos that would help establish his timeline and financial capabilities. 27 million in assets seized so far, one agent reported through my earpiece. Multiple vehicles, real estate holdings, investment accounts. This family was living very well on stolen money. My phone buzzed with a text from Rodriguez's partner, who was overseeing Jennifer's arrest. JW in custody. Asking repeatedly about her brother's widow. Quote, that bitch couldn't possibly understand the complexity of environmental consulting. I smiled grimly. Even while being arrested for federal crimes, Jennifer couldn't bring herself to credit me with intelligence. The media had arrived by the time David was led outside in handcuffs. Local news crews, print reporters, photographers, capturing the perp walk that would be front-page news across Louisiana. Prominent family arrested in environmental fraud scheme. The headlines would read, 20-year conspiracy stole millions from hurricane protection funds. But my favorite moment came as David was being placed in the back of an FBI vehicle. He looked directly at me, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. You were nothing, he said, his voice carrying across the street. You were nobody. Marcus's charity case. How could you possibly? I was Marcus's wife, I replied calmly, and I inherited everything he left behind, including the evidence of what you helped him do. The door slammed shut, cutting off his protests. I watched the vehicle drive away, carrying David Williams to a federal detention facility, where he'd await trial for crimes that would likely earn him 15 to 20 years in prison. Around me, the controlled chaos of a major federal bust continued. Evidence boxes being loaded into trucks, neighbors gathering to watch the spectacle, media reporters preparing their stories about the downfall of a prominent New Orleans family. Agent Rodriguez appeared at my side. How are you holding up? Better than I have in 20 years, I replied honestly. How did Jennifer and Paul take their arrests? Jennifer demanded to speak to her lawyer. Paul tried to claim he was just following orders and didn't understand the scope of the conspiracy. And the evidence, overwhelming. Your recordings from the dinner, combined with Marcus's documents and the financial records we seized. Today, we have them dead to rights on multiple felonies. I looked back at David's house, now marked with federal seizure notices, its windows dark and empty. Tomorrow, it would be appraised and prepared for asset forfeiture proceedings. The proceeds would go toward restitution for the communities that Williams' family had defrauded. Agent Rodriguez, I said, when do I get to testify? Soon, Mrs. Williams. Very soon. Are you ready to tell the world what this family did to you and to the people of Louisiana? I thought about 20 years of grief and isolation, of playing poor while sitting on millions, of enduring condescension from people who'd stolen disaster relief money from hurricane victims. I've been ready for 20 years, I said. My victim impact statement lay on the witness stand podium, 3 pages of carefully chosen words that represented 20 years of pain, betrayal, and finally, vindication. The federal courtroom was packed. Media representatives, community activists, environmental advocates, and families from the communities that had been defrauded by the Williams conspiracy. Mrs. Williams, the prosecutor said gently, please, tell the court about your relationship with the defendants and how their crimes affected your life. I looked across the courtroom to where David, Jennifer, and Paul sat at the defense table in their expensive suits, flanked by high-priced attorneys. Their faces were masks of controlled desperation, people accustomed to wealth and privilege, now facing the reality of federal prison sentences. Your Honor, I began, my voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. I married Marcus Williams in 2003, believing I was joining a family that shared his commitment to environmental protection and community service. For 20 years, I lived with the consequences of that family's betrayal, not just of me, but of every community they claimed to protect. I described the aftermath of Marcus's death, the family's immediate abandonment, their whispered comments about my poverty at family gatherings I was rarely invited to attend. I explained how I'd worked minimum wage jobs while they lived in luxury, how I'd shopped at thrift stores while they vacationed in Europe, how I'd been treated as a burden while they enjoyed the profits from crimes I knew nothing about. The defendants didn't just steal money, I continued. They stole safety from vulnerable communities. They stole dignity from Marcus's memory, and they stole 20 years of my life, forcing me to live in hiding while they enjoyed the proceeds of their crimes. David's attorney objected to my characterization of the conspiracy, but Judge Morrison allowed my testimony to continue. Mrs. Williams, the defense has suggested that you were a willing participant in your husband's crimes, that your claims of ignorance are not credible. How do you respond to that? I'd been prepared for this attack on my credibility, Your Honor. If I had known about Marcus's crimes while he was alive, if I had been a willing participant in money laundering and fraud, why would I have spent the next 20 years working as a waitress and office cleaner? Why would I have lived in a modest house, driven an old car, shopped at discount stores? If I had access to millions of dollars in offshore accounts, what possible reason would I have had to maintain such an elaborate charade of poverty? The logic was unassailable, and I could see several jurors nodding in agreement. Furthermore, I continued, the evidence shows that the defendants themselves believed I was ignorant of Marcus's crimes. Their own emails and communications, recorded conversations, and financial surveillance all confirm that they viewed me as a potential threat who needed to be monitored and marginalized, not as a co-conspirator who deserved a share of the profits. I read portions of David's emails about keeping me under observation, about ensuring I didn't discover Marcus's records, about maintaining minimal contact to avoid raising my suspicions. The defendants squirmed as their own words were used to establish my innocence. The defense would have you believe that I spent 20 years pretending to be poor while secretly enjoying millions in stolen money, I said. But the evidence shows the opposite, that the defendants spent 20 years enjoying millions in stolen money while pretending to care about the poor widow they'd abandoned. When I finished my formal statement, the prosecutor asked me to describe specific impacts of the defendants' crimes. The St. Bernard Parish Wetlands Project, I said, referring to my notes. Marcus's shell company was paid $3.2 million to restore 500 acres of wetlands and build storm surge barriers. The actual work completed was minimal grading and decorative plantings that washed away in the first storm season. I held up photographs of the site before and after shots that showed barren land where protective wetlands should have been. When Hurricane Gustav hit in 2008, that entire area flooded because the protection systems that residents had paid for didn't exist. Families lost their homes, their possessions, their sense of security, so the defendants could steal disaster relief money. I described project after project, community after community, that had been betrayed by the Williams family's greed. The Plaquemines Parish levee reinforcement that was never completed. The post-Katrina reconstruction work that existed only on paper. The environmental protection systems that were invoiced but never built. These weren't victimless crimes. I emphasized, every dollar the defendants stole was a dollar that should have protected families from hurricanes. Every fake project they invoiced was real protection that vulnerable communities never received. The defense attorneys tried to paint Marcus as the mastermind and their clients as unwitting accomplices, but the evidence I'd provided made that impossible. David's emails showed detailed knowledge of the fraud. Jennifer's communications revealed active participation in the cover-up. Paul's inspection reports documented his deliberate failure to identify substandard work. The defendants have spent months trying to blame my deceased husband for their crimes, I said during cross-examination. But Marcus has been dead for 20 years, who was stealing environmental protection money for the 15 years after his death, who was living in luxury while communities remained vulnerable, who was profiting from ongoing fraud while treating Marcus's widow like a charity case. David's attorney made one final attempt to undermine my testimony. Mrs. Williams, isn't it true that you stand to benefit financially from these prosecutions, that you've negotiated agreements to keep portions of the recovered assets? Yes, I replied without hesitation. I've agreed to help return the stolen money to the communities it was taken from. I've agreed to establish a foundation that will provide real environmental protection for hurricane-vulnerable areas. I've agreed to spend the rest of my life trying to undo the damage that these defendants caused. But you'll be personally enriched by these agreements. I'll have enough money to live comfortably while doing that work, I acknowledged. But unlike the defendants, I won't be living on money stolen from disaster victims. I'll be living on compensation for helping recover stolen funds and establish genuine environmental protection. Judge Morrison's sentencing was swift and severe. David received 22 years in federal prison plus restitution of $8.7 million. Jennifer received 18 years plus $6.2 million in restitution. Paul received 15 years plus $4.1 million in restitution. The defendants operated a sophisticated conspiracy that stole over $27 million from environmental protection programs, Judge Morrison said. Their crimes left communities vulnerable to natural disasters and betrayed the public trust in environmental oversight. The sentences reflect both the scale of their crimes and the need for deterrence. As the defendants were led away in shackles, David turned to look at me one final time. The rage and disbelief were gone, replaced by something that might have been resignation or even respect. You won, he said quietly. The communities won, I corrected. The families who were betrayed won. Justice won. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded me with questions about my plans, my foundation, my feelings about the sentences, but I kept my answers brief and focused on the victims of the Williams family's crimes. Today isn't about revenge, I said. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that disaster relief money goes to protecting families, not enriching criminals. It's about honoring the memory of everyone who died because the protection they paid for was never built. As I walked away from the courthouse, I felt 20 years of weight lifting from my shoulders. The performance was finally over. Grace Williams, the broke widow, could rest. Grace Williams, the environmental justice advocate, was ready to begin. The asset recovery documents spread across my lawyer's conference table told a story of wealth that even I found difficult to comprehend. After 20 years of living modestly, of carefully counting every dollar, of maintaining the fiction of poverty, I was finally confronting the full scope of what Marcus had left me. The total recovered assets come to $31.7 million. My attorney, Sarah Chen, explained as she walked me through the complex legal proceedings. This includes the offshore accounts, the domestic holdings, the real estate seized from the co-conspirators, and the proceeds from asset forfeiture. I stared at the numbers, remembering the $18,000 I'd thought was my entire inheritance, and legally, as Marcus's widow, I'm entitled to all of this. Under federal law, yes. You're the legal heir to Marcus's estate, including assets that were hidden or laundered through criminal activities. The fact that you were unaware of these assets at the time of his death doesn't change your legal right to inherit them." The irony was staggering. For 20 years, I'd been the rightful owner of a fortune that dwarfed the Williams family's wildest dreams, while they'd lived in luxury on their smaller shares of the stolen money. While they'd treated me as a burden and an embarrassment, I had been sitting on the largest portion of the criminal proceeds. However, Sarah continued, there are significant moral and legal complexities we need to address. This money was stolen from environmental protection programs. It should have gone to protecting communities from natural disasters. I nodded, having wrestled with this ethical dilemma since the day Agent Rodriguez first showed me the offshore account statements. What are my options? Legally, you could keep the money and face no criminal liability. You've been granted immunity in exchange for your cooperation with the investigation, but practically, there would be enormous public pressure to return the funds to their intended purposes. I thought about the families in St. Bernard Parish, who'd lost their homes because the wetlands protection they'd paid for was never built. I thought about the communities throughout Louisiana that remained vulnerable to storms because levees were never reinforced, drainage systems were never improved, environmental protections were never installed. I want to establish a foundation, I said. I want to use this money to provide real environmental protection for the communities that were defrauded. Sarah smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. I've already begun preliminary work on a structure that would allow you to retain enough assets to live comfortably while dedicating the majority to environmental restoration and disaster preparedness. We spent the next several hours designing what would become the Marcus Williams Memorial Foundation for Environmental Justice. The foundation would focus specifically on providing genuine environmental protection for communities that had been victims of fraud or neglect. The foundation will need an operational budget, Sarah explained. Staff salaries, administrative costs, program expenses. We can structure it so that you serve as the executive director with a reasonable salary, plus living expenses and benefits. How much is reasonable for managing a foundation of this size with your expertise in environmental fraud detection? I'd recommend $200,000 annually plus benefits. That would leave approximately $30 million for direct program work. The amount was more than I'd ever imagined earning, but it was also a fraction of what I could legally claim. More importantly, it would allow me to dedicate my life to undoing the damage that Marcus and his family had caused. There's another consideration, Sarah said. The foundation will need to be completely transparent about its funding sources. There will be media attention, public scrutiny, and probably some criticism about blood money being used for charitable purposes. I'd anticipated this challenge. I think that's appropriate. The communities we'll be serving deserve to know exactly where the money comes from and why it's being returned to them. We discussed the foundation's structure, its oversight mechanisms, its accountability measures. I wanted everything to be above board, with independent auditing, community input, and regular public reporting. The first major project should be the St. Bernard Parish wetlands restoration, I said. We'll complete the work that Marcus's shell company was paid to do but never finished. We'll build the storm surge barriers, restore the wetlands, install the drainage systems, everything that was promised 20 years ago. That's a powerful statement, Sarah agreed. Returning to the scene of the original crime to make it right. Over the following weeks, we established the legal framework for the foundation. I hired a small staff of environmental engineers, community organizers, and project managers. We opened offices in New Orleans and began reaching out to the communities that had been defrauded. The response was overwhelming. Parish officials, community leaders, environmental advocates, and individual families came forward with stories of promised protection that never materialized, a vulnerability that persisted despite millions in supposed investment. Mrs. Williams, said Marie Boudreau, a community leader from Plaquemines Parish, during our first public meeting, my family has lived in this area for 4 generations. We've seen every hurricane, every flood, every storm surge. When they told us the levees were being reinforced, when they showed us the contracts and the plans, we believed we'd finally be safe. But you weren't, I said quietly. When Hurricane Isaac hit in 2012, the water came right through where the new barriers were supposed to be. We lost everything again. And now we find out that the money meant to protect us went to buy vacation homes and luxury cars. These were the conversations that made my decision unshakable. The Williams family had stolen more than money. They'd stolen hope, security, the basic right of communities to trust in their government's promise of protection. The Foundation's first project broke ground 6 months after the trials ended. We returned to the St. Bernard Parish site, where Marcus's fake company had supposedly restored 500 acres of wetlands. This time, we brought real engineers, real environmental scientists, and a commitment to genuine restoration. 20 years later, we're finally building what should have been built in 2003. I told the gathered crowd of community members, local officials, and media representatives, the Marcus Williams Memorial Foundation exists to transform stolen money into real protection for real families. The work was complex and expensive. Genuine environmental restoration always is. We installed proper drainage systems, built effective storm surge barriers, restored native wetlands with appropriate plant species and maintenance protocols. What Marcus's shell company had claimed to do for $3.2 million actually cost $4.8 million when done correctly, but it was real. When Hurricane Francine tested our work the following year, the restored wetlands and reinforced barriers held. The community that had flooded repeatedly over the past 2 decades remained dry and safe. You did it, Marie Boudreau told me after the storm passed. You actually did what you promised. We did what should have been done 20 years ago, I replied. What you paid for 20 years ago. The success of the St. Bernard project opened doors throughout the Gulf Coast. Communities that had been defrauded by various environmental schemes reached out for help. The foundation expanded its scope, taking on wetlands restoration in Mississippi, levee reinforcement in Alabama, coastal protection in Texas. Each project was a lesson in the true cost of environmental fraud. The money that criminals stole wasn't just numbers in bank accounts, it was protection that never came, safety that never arrived, hope that was betrayed by greed. Within 3 years, the foundation had completed 12 major environmental projects, protecting over 40,000 people from hurricane and flood damage. We'd restored 2,000 acres of wetlands, reinforced 25 miles of levees, and installed drainage systems in 8 vulnerable communities. But the most satisfying moment came when I received a letter from David Williams in federal prison. After years of silence, Marcus's brother had finally written to me. Grace, the letter began, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. But I wanted you to know that I've been following the Foundation's work through news reports and court documents. You're doing what we should have done 20 years ago. You're keeping the promises we broke. He went on to acknowledge the full scope of their crimes, the communities they'd betrayed, the environmental destruction they'd caused through negligence and greed. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was recognition, perhaps the first honest thing a Williams family member had said to me in 20 years. I understand now why Marcus chose you. The letter concluded, you have a strength that none of us ever had, the strength to do what's right even when it costs you everything. The letter moved me more than I'd expected. After all the anger, all the betrayal, all the years of performance and planning, David Williams had finally seen me clearly, not as the broke widow, not as the family burden, but as the person who'd had the courage to transform blood money into genuine protection for vulnerable communities. I kept the letter in my office desk, a reminder of how far we'd all traveled from that first family reunion where they'd whispered "broke widow" behind their champagne glasses. They'd been right about one thing: I had been broken. But I'd used those broken pieces to build something stronger than any of them had ever imagined. The Katrina Memorial Foundation Charter hangs framed in my office, a simple document that represents the transformation of $27 million in stolen money into genuine hope for hurricane-vulnerable communities. 5 years after the trials, the foundation has become something I never imagined when I first sat in Agent Rodriguez's office, a living memorial to everyone who died because the protection they paid for was never built. Mrs. Williams, we have the final report on the Lafourche Parish project. My project manager, Dr. Elena Busquis, said as she entered my office with a thick folder. The community leaders want to present you with something at next week's dedication ceremony. I looked up from the quarterly financials I'd been reviewing. The foundation now operated with the precision of a major environmental organization, managing dozens of active projects across 5 states. But every number on these reports represented families who would sleep safer because of work that should have been done decades ago. What kind of presentation? I asked. They've commissioned a memorial garden, native plants, storm-resistant landscaping, and a monument honoring Hurricane Katrina victims. They want to dedicate it to Marcus's memory and to your work correcting what was done in his name. The irony still took my breath away sometimes. Marcus had died a hero, saving strangers during Katrina, but his name had been used to commit crimes against the very communities he'd died protecting. Now that same name was associated with genuine environmental justice. That's beautiful, I said. What's the status of the actual protective infrastructure? Complete and tested. The levee reinforcements held during last month's tropical storm, the drainage systems performed exactly as designed, and the restored wetlands are thriving. For the first time in 30 years, Lafourche Parish has genuine hurricane protection. I walked to my office window, looking out over the New Orleans skyline toward the communities we'd helped protect. In 5 years, the foundation had completed 43 major projects, protecting over 150,000 people from hurricane and flood damage. We'd restored 8,000 acres of wetlands, reinforced 120 miles of levees, and installed comprehensive drainage systems in 22 vulnerable communities. But the numbers, impressive as they were, didn't capture the real impact. The impact was measured in families who no longer evacuated for every storm threat, in communities that had rebuilt with confidence, in children who could grow up without the constant fear of losing everything to the next hurricane. Dr. Vasquez, how many applications do we have for next year's projects? 67, requesting a total of $43 million in environmental protection work. We'll need to expand our funding base if we want to meet even half of that demand. This was the challenge I'd been anticipating. The initial $27 million from the Williams family conspiracy had been supplemented by federal environmental grants, private foundation donations, and individual contributions. But the need for genuine environmental protection far exceeded our resources. I've been thinking about that, I said. What if we started training other communities to identify environmental fraud? What if we created a certification program for legitimate environmental consulting firms? Elena's eyes lit up. A network of community-based fraud detection and authentic environmental protection. Exactly. We can't protect every vulnerable community with direct funding, but we can teach communities how to protect themselves from fraud and how to demand genuine protection. Over the next hour, we outlined what would become the Foundation's most ambitious program, the Community Environmental Justice Network. We would train local leaders to recognize the warning signs of environmental fraud, provide resources for verifying contractor credentials and project completion, and create a database of certified environmental firms with proven track records. Mrs. Williams, Elena said, as we wrapped up our planning session, "Can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Do you ever regret the path that brought you here? The 20 years of hiding, the performance of poverty, the isolation from Marcus's family?" I considered the question carefully. It wasn't the first time someone had asked about the cost of my long deception, about whether I could have found a different way to expose the truth. "I regret that Marcus was involved in fraud," I said finally. "I regret that his family chose crime over service. I regret that communities suffered while I was learning the truth. But do I regret the path that led to this foundation, to this work, to the protection we've provided for thousands of families? No, I don't regret that." The dedication ceremony in Lafourche Parish was held on a perfect autumn day, with blue skies and gentle breezes that felt like a blessing. The memorial garden was more beautiful than I'd imagined that of Louisiana. Plants arranged around a simple stone monument engraved with the names of Katrina victims, and a quote from Marcus's final letter. "I fix things that are broken, Grace. Williams has shown us that broken things can be made stronger than they were before," said Parish President James Thibodeau, as he addressed the crowd of several hundred community members. "She's shown us that even the worst betrayals can be transformed into the most powerful justice." After the ceremony, I walked through the community with Marie Boudreau, who had become both a close friend and a powerful advocate for environmental justice. We visited families and homes that no longer flooded, businesses that no longer closed for every storm threat, schools that no longer served as evacuation centers. "You know what the real victory is," Marie said as we stood on the new levee, looking out over the restored wetlands that stretched to the horizon. "What's that?" "My granddaughter doesn't know what it feels like to lose everything to a hurricane. She's never had to start over, never had to wonder if the adults in her life can actually protect her from the storms. That's what you gave us, Grace. You gave us the luxury of normal life." That evening, I sat in my hotel room, video Agent Rodriguez, who had become something more than a professional colleague over the years of working together on environmental fraud cases. "How was the dedication?" he asked, his familiar tired eyes brightening as he saw my face on the screen. "Beautiful. Overwhelming. Worth every minute of the last 25 years. Any regrets about the path not taken?" I smiled, recognizing Elena's earlier question. "Are you asking professionally or personally?" "Both. Professionally, I'm proud of what we've accomplished. The Foundation has transformed blood money into genuine protection for vulnerable communities. We've created a model for environmental justice that's being replicated across the country. And personally, I looked out the hotel window toward the lights of a community that could finally sleep peacefully through storm season. Personally, I think I'm finally ready to stop being Marcus Williams's widow and start being Grace Williams, environmental justice advocate. I think I'm ready to build a life based on truth rather than performance." Rodriguez smiled. "I think that sounds like an excellent plan. And Grace, yes, I think Marcus would be proud of what you've built in his name." For the first time in 25 years, I believed that might actually be true. Agent Rodriguez's personal phone number was written on a simple white card tucked into my wallet, next to my driver's license and credit cards. Such a small thing to represent such a significant shift from the professional relationship that had brought down the Williams conspiracy to something much more personal and hopeful. "Grace, you know you don't have to keep calling me Agent Rodriguez," Miguel said as we walked along the Mississippi River levee on a quiet Sunday afternoon. "The case closed 3 years ago. We're not working together anymore." "Old habits," I replied, though we both knew it was more than that. For so long, our relationship had been defined by the investigation, by the careful boundaries between law enforcement and cooperative witness. Learning to see each other as simply two people who cared about each other had been surprisingly difficult. Miguel had been patient with my hesitation, understanding better than most what 25 years of deception and performance had cost me. "You spent half your adult life pretending to be someone you weren't," he'd said during one of our early conversations after the trials ended. "It makes sense that being authentic feels foreign. I'm not sure I know who the authentic Grace Williams is." I'd admitted, "I've been Marcus's wife, then Marcus's widow, then the broke widow, then the woman who brought down his family. I've never just been me. So let's figure that out together." The relationship had developed slowly, carefully, like the environmental restoration projects that had taught me the value of patience and proper foundation building. We'd started with professional debriefings after the trials, then occasional dinners to discuss ongoing environmental fraud cases, then regular coffee meetings that had less and less to do with work. Miguel understood the complexities of my situation in ways that few people could. He'd seen the evidence of my 20-year performance, understood the psychological toll of living a lie for so long, recognized the difficulty of building genuine relationships after decades of careful deception. "The hardest part," I told him one evening as we sat on my back porch, "is trusting that people like me for who I really am, not for who they think I am." "Who do you think you really are?" he asked. I'd been wrestling with that question for years. "I think I'm someone who learned that strength sometimes looks like weakness, that justice sometimes requires patience, that the most powerful revenge is transformation rather than destruction." "I think you're someone who spent 25 years preparing to do the most important work of your life," Miguel replied. "Someone who turned personal betrayal into community healing." Our first real date, as opposed to professional meetings or casual dinners, was at a small restaurant in the French Quarter, chosen specifically because it held no memories of my previous life, no family gatherings, no performances of poverty, no careful maintenance of facades. "I'm nervous," I admitted as we waited for our table. "About dinner, about this, about us, about the possibility of building something real with someone who knows all my secrets." Miguel took my hand. "Grace, I fell in love with the woman who spent 20 years playing a role to protect communities from environmental fraud. I fell in love with someone brave enough to risk everything for justice. Your secrets aren't something to overcome that part of what makes you extraordinary." The evening had been perfect in its simplicity. Good food, easy conversation, the comfortable silence of two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. For the first time in decades, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged, with exactly the right person. "I have something to tell you," Miguel said as we walked back to my car. "I've been offered a position with the Environmental Protection Agency. It would mean relocating to Washington, heading up a new environmental crimes task force. My heart sank, though I tried to keep my expression neutral. That sounds like an amazing opportunity. It is, but it would also mean leaving New Orleans, leaving you. We stood on the sidewalk, the lights of the quarter reflecting off the night sky, both of us understanding that we'd reached a crossroads. What if you didn't have to choose? I asked quietly. What do you mean? The foundation has been talking about expanding our advocacy work, maybe opening a Washington office to work directly with federal environmental agencies. What if we both made the move? What if we built something together in D.C. while keeping our roots here? Miguel's face lit up with possibility. A foundation office focused on federal environmental policy, working directly with EPA to identify and prevent fraud, and a life together, I added. A real life, built on truth instead of performance. Grace Williams, are you asking me to move in with you? I laughed, surprising myself with how natural it felt. I think I'm asking you to build a future with me. A real future, with someone who knows exactly who I am and loves me anyway. The answer is yes, he said, pulling me close to all of it. The move, the work, the future, the life together, yes. 6 months later, we opened the Marcus Williams Memorial Foundation's Washington office in a renovated townhouse near Capitol Hill. Miguel's EPA task force worked closely with our fraud detection programs, creating the first integrated approach to preventing environmental crimes before they could harm communities. Mrs. Williams, Grace, said Congresswoman Sarah Martinez during a hearing on environmental fraud prevention. Your foundation's work has revolutionized how we think about protecting vulnerable communities. What advice would you give to other fraud victims who might be afraid to come forward? I looked out at the packed hearing room, at the community advocates and environmental lawyers and federal officials who had become my colleagues and allies. I would tell them that the truth is always more powerful than the lie, I replied. That justice sometimes takes decades, but it's worth the wait, and that the most meaningful revenge isn't destroying the people who hurt you, it's building something so beautiful and strong that their crimes become the foundation for someone else's healing. After the hearing, Miguel and I walked hand in hand through the Capitol grounds, discussing the legislation that would expand environmental fraud penalties and community protection programs. Do you ever miss the performance? He asked as we sat on a bench overlooking the reflecting pool. You mean playing the broke widow? I mean the simplicity of having a clear role to play, even if it wasn't authentic. I considered the question. Sometimes, there was a strange kind of safety in pretending to be powerless, but I liked this better: the complexity of being real, the risk of being fully known, the possibility of building something genuine, even when genuine means complicated. Especially then, I said, squeezing his hand. The best environmental restoration is always complicated. It takes time, patience, proper planning, and the willingness to do the work even when nobody's watching. Building a real relationship is the same way. Speaking of which, Miguel said, reaching into his jacket pocket, I have something for you. He pulled out a small box, and my breath caught. Miguel, Grace Williams, he said, dropping to one knee right there on the Capitol grounds. You are the strongest, most patient, most justice-minded person I've ever known. You turned betrayal into healing, deception into truth, isolation into community. Will you marry me? Through tears I didn't expect, I looked at the ring, a simple band with a small diamond that caught the late afternoon light like hope itself. Yes, I said, pulling him up to kiss him. Yes, to everything. To marriage, to partnership, to building something real together. As we held each other on that bench, I thought about the 25-year journey that had brought me to this moment. From naive newlywed to abandoned widow, to environmental justice advocate, to woman in love again. Every role had been necessary, every performance had served its purpose, every deception had led to this truth. I was finally ready to be just Grace Williams, without qualifiers or explanations or carefully maintained facades, and for the first time since Marcus died in that hurricane, I was genuinely excited about the future. The new wedding ring catches the morning light streaming through the windows of our DC townhouse as I prepare coffee for Miguel and myself, a simple domestic ritual that still feels miraculous after so many years of isolation. The ring is different from the one Marcus gave me 28 years ago, simpler and more modern, representing partnership rather than dependence, truth rather than secrets. The Williams parole hearings are scheduled for next month, Miguel says, reviewing his tablet over breakfast. David's attorney thinks he has a strong case for early release after serving 12 years. I nod, having expected this news. He's been a model prisoner, participated in the environmental restoration programs, written extensively about white-collar crime prevention. I think he's genuinely changed. How do you feel about that? It's a question I've been asking myself for months. David Williams, the man who spent 15 years dismissing me as a broke widow while living on money stolen from hurricane victims, will likely be released from federal prison within the year. His sister Jennifer was released last year and has been working with a nonprofit focused on environmental justice. Even Paul has found legitimate work as an environmental compliance consultant, using his inside knowledge of regulatory failures to help companies operate ethically. I think prison served its purpose, I say finally. They paid for their crimes, they've acknowledged the harm they caused, and they're contributing to solutions now. Isn't that what justice is supposed to accomplish? Miguel smiles. One of the many things I love about him, his ability to see beyond punishment to redemption. The Marcus Williams Memorial Foundation has received a request for funding from David's reentry program. They want to establish an environmental fraud prevention workshop for former inmates. Really, he's not asking for personal gain. He wants to train other white-collar criminals to recognize and report environmental fraud when they're released, using his experience to prevent future crimes. I look out the window toward the Capitol Dome, thinking about the legislation we've helped pass, the communities we've protected, the model of environmental justice we've created over the past decade. The foundation now operates in 12 states, has completed over 200 environmental protection projects, and has trained thousands of community advocates to recognize and prevent fraud. I think we should fund it, I say, not because I've forgiven the Williams family, but because the work is important. Because former criminals who understand fraud schemes are perfectly positioned to prevent future crimes. You've come a long way from the woman who wanted to watch them get arrested. I still wanted to watch them get arrested, I laugh. But that was about accountability, not revenge. Now they're accountable, and they're using their knowledge to help others. That's all I ever really wanted. My phone buzzes with a text from Marie Boudreau in Louisiana. Grace, you need to see the news. Hurricane Ida is heading straight for New Orleans, Category 4, but our communities are ready. The protection you helped build is going to save thousands of lives. I turn on the weather coverage, watching the massive storm approaching the Gulf Coast. In the old days, before the foundations worked, this would have been a catastrophe. Communities with inadequate levees, failed drainage systems, and non-existent wetlands protection would have been devastated. But now, as I watch the meteor explain the storm's projected path, I see something different. The communities we've worked with, St. Bernard Parish, Plaquemines Parish, Lafourche Parish, dozens of others have genuine protection, real levees, functioning drainage systems, restored wetlands that will absorb storm surge. Miguel, look at this, I say, pointing to the weather map. Every single community that's in the hurricane's path has been protected by foundation projects. This is the first time in decades that a major hurricane will hit Louisiana communities that actually have the infrastructure they were promised. We spend the day monitoring the storm coverage, texting with community leaders, coordinating with emergency management officials. The hurricane makes landfall as predicted, bringing massive winds and dangerous storm surge, but the infrastructure holds. The levees we rebuilt don't fail. The drainage systems we installed work as designed. The wetlands we restored absorb the storm's energy and protect the communities behind them. 0 fatalities in the protected communities, Miguel reports, reading from his phone. Some flooding, some wind damage, but no loss of life. Grace, the work you've done, the work the foundation has done, it literally saved lives today. I sit quietly, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what we've accomplished. 28 years ago, Marcus died trying to save strangers during Hurricane Katrina. Today, the foundation built in his memory saved thousands of people from a storm just as powerful. There's something else, Miguel says. David Williams called the foundation office from prison. He wanted to thank you personally for the work you've done in Marcus's name. He said, Dan, I'm quoting, Grace understood what Marcus was trying to do better than any of us ever did. The call comes through an hour later, rooted through the prison's communication system. David's voice is different, humbler, more genuine than I remember. Grace, I know I have no right to call you, but I needed to say something. I've been watching the hurricane coverage, seeing how the communities you've protected are weathering the storm. You did what we should have done 20 years ago. You kept the promises we broke. Thank you for saying that, David. I've been thinking about Marcus a lot lately, about the man he was before he got involved in the fraud, about the work he genuinely wanted to do. You built the legacy he should have had. We all made choices. David, Marcus, you, Jennifer, me. The important thing is that communities are protected now. Grayscan, I ask you something. Do you think Marcus would be proud of what you've accomplished? I look at Miguel, who's listening quietly. Then at my wedding rings, one representing the past, one representing the future. I think Marcus would be amazed that his death led to genuine environmental protection for vulnerable communities. I think he'd be proud that his name is now associated with justice rather than fraud. And I think he'd be happy that I found love, again with someone who shares his commitment to protecting people from preventable disasters. That's beautiful. Grace, thank you for transforming something ugly into something meaningful. After the call ends, Miguel and I sit together on our couch, watching the continued hurricane coverage, seeing community after community that's surviving a major storm because of infrastructure that actually works. Any regrets? Miguel asks, echoing the question that's followed me for years, about the 28-year journey that brought us here, about the performance, the investigation, the trials, the foundation, meeting you, building this life together. I lean against his shoulder, feeling the solid weight of genuine partnership. Not one regret, even about the years of hiding. Especially about the years of hiding. I learned patience. I learned the value of truth. I learned that justice is worth waiting for. Most importantly, I learned that the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's building something so beautiful that their worst crimes become the foundation for someone else's healing. Outside our window, the lights of Washington flicker in the evening darkness. Tomorrow, we'll return to our work at the foundation, to the ongoing effort to protect vulnerable communities from environmental fraud and disaster. We'll continue building the model of environmental justice that's being replicated around the world. But tonight, I'm content to sit with my husband, watching communities survive a hurricane because the protection they were promised was finally delivered. I'm content to be Grace Williams, not Marcus's widow, not the broke widow, not the woman who brought down a criminal conspiracy, but simply Grace Williams, environmental advocate, foundation director, wife, and woman who learned that the longest road to justice is often the most rewarding one. The girl who married Marcus Williams in 2003 could never have imagined this life, but she also could never have imagined the strength she'd find in betrayal, the power she'd discover in patience, or the love she'd build from truth. Sometimes the best stories take 28 years to tell. Sometimes justice requires a lifetime of preparation. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is transform the worst thing that ever happened to you into the best thing you ever accomplished. The foundation will continue, the communities will remain protected, and Grace Williams will keep building a world where promises are kept, where protection is real, and where the vulnerable are never left to face the storms alone. As I prepare for bed, I walk through our house, turning off lights and checking locks, simple routines that anchor me in this authentic life I've built. In the study, I pause at the wall where Marcus's final letter hangs framed beside our marriage certificate, Agent Rodriguez's first business card, the Katrina Memorial Foundation charter, and a photo from our wedding day last spring. Each artifact tells part of the story: love and loss, betrayal and justice, performance and truth, isolation and partnership. Together, they form a narrative I never could have planned but somehow always knew I was meant to live. Miguel appears in the doorway, ready for bed. What are you thinking about? 28 years, I say. From naive newlywed to environmental justice advocate, from playing poor to actually changing lives, from Marcus's widow to your wife. Any chapters you'd rewrite? I consider this carefully, looking at each framed piece of my journey. I might have confronted Marcus about his secrets while he was alive. I might have reached out for help instead of hiding for so long. But honestly, every mistake, every performance, every lonely year taught me something I needed to know for this work. Even the Williams family's betrayal, especially that their abandonment, forced me to become self-reliant. Their condescension motivated me to prove them wrong. Their crimes gave me the resources to help communities they'd harmed. Even their cruelty served a purpose. Miguel turns off the study light, and we walk upstairs together. You know what I love most about your story? What's that? You didn't just survive betrayal, you transformed it into hope for thousands of families. You didn't just expose criminals, you built systems to prevent future crimes. You didn't just seek justice, you created healing. In our bedroom, I place my wedding rings on the nightstand, the simple ritual that marks the end of each day in my authentic life. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new communities to protect, new opportunities to expand our environmental justice work. But tonight, I'm exactly where I belong. Miguel, I say as we settle into bed, do you think people are defined by what happens to them, or by how they respond to what happens to them? I think people are defined by their choices over time, he replies. By the long arc of their decisions, not by individual moments of triumph or failure. Then I'm proud of who I chose to become. As sleep takes hold, I think one final time about the broke widow who sat in that family reunion, enduring whispered comments and condescending smiles. She had no idea that her patience would be rewarded, that her performance would serve justice, that her isolation would prepare her for leadership. She had no idea that, 23 years later, she'd be lying next to a man who loved her completely, in a house filled with evidence of meaningful work, in a life built on truth rather than deception. The woman who married Marcus Williams wanted safety and love. The widow who buried him wanted answers and justice. The woman who married Miguel Rodriguez wanted partnership and purpose. All three got exactly what they needed, just not in the ways they expected. Sometimes the best stories take a lifetime to tell. Sometimes justice requires decades of preparation. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is trust that truth will always find the light, even when it takes 28 years to get there.